at some point we begin to see those people. We see the people cleaning up after us, or if we are the people who are doing the cleaning up, we see more fully the people who've left the mess. We begin to see someone else's contributions, someone else's struggles, someone else's humanity. We begin to recognize in one another our kindredness, our sisterhood, our brotherhood with the entire family of existence. And as we sense that connectedness with all people and living things, we realize that what I do, what you do, what we do actually matters. And then we bend over to pick up that towel or the piece of paper that falls on the ground, because otherwise we feel the pain and loneliness in ourselves that happens when we sever ourselves from the people who live around us. I feel like this is a lifelong, forever learning that I'm going to be doing, and why we'll talk about it all the time in church. Why do we need to remind ourselves all the time that we're connected? Why is that? Well, I forget it all of the time. I can literally be surrounded by cars, by people, by annoying people in the line in front of me at the grocery store, while I feel inside utterly isolated. Have you felt that? Even as, look around, I've never actually been totally isolated ever in my life. Not even on a backpacking trip in the Adirondacks could I be alone. And yet, it's so easy for us to feel like, I'm the only one here. So we do this work of connecting ourselves, weaving ourselves back into the flow of life that is always here, of which we are a part. And service work for me is one of the ways that I do that. I think I'm not a cyborg, so I will forever be human. And I will always have this thought process in my head that comes in and says, you're unique and you're all alone. And so one of the tools that I use to help counter that, to stitch me back into the fabric of reality, is service work. And I haven't always done service work. I didn't grow up doing that. I was one of 5 kids, and in my family, I think service was just surviving. But in college, I had a professor who said to me, hey, Erin, what are you planning on doing with your degree? And I said, I don't know, maybe I'll be a professor. And she said, I think maybe you're saying that because it's the only thing you know about. Why don't you try going into the community and volunteering to see where you might have a connection, what might be of interest to you? Well, I was in college and I had been studying how to make the world a better place. Yep, can you imagine hearing that from your child? That all of the college tuition you're paying is going to study the subject of making the world a better place. Well, that's what I did. I was on the dean's list in that subject, but I'm grateful that my parents were proud, albeit concerned for my future. But I was studying cultural anthropology and trying to figure out our systems of inequality and how I could personally dismantle all of them. But I thought, all right, what harm could it cause to start volunteering and take what I'm learning that's in books and actually connect to people's real lives? So I had no idea where to start, but my mom was a case manager at a homeless shelter in Rockford, Illinois, and I thought, why don't I go volunteer at a homeless shelter? So I called up, and they trained me, and they gave me a position as a shift supervisor every so often. And my job was to make sure that the meals were cooked, that the chores got done, that people were in by curfew, and that if somebody needed something, I helped them out. And primarily, I just had to pretend like I knew something about anything, which was hard because I was 20 years old, and I was living in my very first apartment myself, and going to the grocery store still felt like this novel adventure, pushing the cart and paying for groceries. So what did I know about working full-time and not making enough money to pay your rent and feed your kids and have gas for your car? What did I know about poverty? I'd been studying it, but I didn't know anything about the hard realities of living in it. So every time I went to the shelter, I felt really uncomfortable, Like, what am I doing in this place? What do I know? How am I going to be of use? Are people going to be annoyed that here I am, this rich little white girl who's in college? And I just felt uncomfortable, and I thought people wouldn't accept me or they would ignore me. But guess what? I quickly learned that these women experiencing homelessness had so many other important topics on their minds. They were trying to feed their kids, bathe them, get them in bed, so that they could then deal with the other concerns addressing and facing their families. And when they did have time to notice me, more often they wanted to share their own stories and find support for the challenges that they faced. And I remember one night sitting at the dinner table with these women, and one of the women was in her 40s, and she told me a story about how she had been working at a factory for 15 years, and she had an injury to her back, which meant that she could no longer work. But her company found that her disability was not their fault. And so they eventually let her go, and she was left without the ability to work, without a paycheck, and without a mortgage payment. And eventually she lost her hard-earned home. And she was devastated, and her pride was wounded. Here she was a hardworking person who found herself left out on the street without a place to stay if it weren't for this shelter. I don't know why she told me her story, but I was grateful. I learned from her, and in that moment, I became a part of a larger reality, of something that was actually happening in the here and now. I was only 20, and up until that point, most of the social concerns I had were remote. They weren't people whose lives I knew. There were things I was reading in books, things I felt passionate about, but I didn't know people's names and faces and stories that connected to the issues that face our society. And I was so grateful to not just be sitting in a classroom learning about all of the ways it's hard to have society and where we just have systems that are broken, and we always will. But that in that moment, I got to be part of a solution to a system that was breaking. It didn't fix it. It didn't solve all of her problems, but I got to be there face to face with her, listening and being in the shelter so that she had a place to stay. You know, it didn't seem like much to me showing up to be there, but because of volunteers like me, this place could stay open. They couldn't afford staff 24/7. Because of volunteers, there was a home, and she had a place to be. I appreciate when I volunteer that I get the chance to be part of something useful, rather than just watching or reading from a distance, where it's so easy for me to feel overwhelmed and immobilized by the immensity of the work to do. Have you felt that? Well, do you know this comedian Louis C.K.? I adore Louis C.K. He talks about in this bit in a stand-up show that he did about his believies. And he says that his believies are these things that he feels that make him feel good about himself, but that he doesn't necessarily have to act on. So he tells an example of how now that he's had great success in his comedic career, he gets to fly first class on the plane. And so he sits up there in first class, and sometimes he'll see a soldier getting on the plane and going back to their seat, and he thinks to himself, you know, I'm going to give that soldier my seat. Their service to our country, I'm going to give him my seat. And then he feels good about himself that, you know, that thought occurred to me, that I would do that. I'm a good guy. And in his wonderful, honest, self-deprecating way, his next comment is, how messed up is that? That he's never even remotely considered ever giving up his seat. He's like, no, why would I go sit back there? I watch all the moms sweating, carrying all their child carriers and all their suitcase, and I just sit there with my cocktail watching them go by. And he says they're his believies because they're things that make him feel good about himself, but that he doesn't really act on because they're kind of inconvenient. Do you have those? Because I know that I do. I have a lot of believies, and I'm like, man, I have a good heart. Well, when I die, I want to be proud of my legacy, not my believies. Right? And volunteering helps me do that. Community organizing helps me do that. Being a part of this church helps me do that. It's when we find a way to put those, it says faith in action, it could say believies in action. That might be even weirder, but for me, the fact that I actually get a way to engage, to take that believie and move it into the real world is such a precious gift. When we engage, we get to engage. We get to move beyond thinking and reading, and we get to actually do something. We get to stop wondering about issues, and we get to learn firsthand from another person and have a moment of connection with them. When we engage, it's profoundly important. Each interaction stitches us into reality. It stitches us into this story that's not just a theory. It's not just a newspaper article. It's not just a political or ideological leaning. It's a real experience of this greater reality of which we truly are a part. And this is one of the ways we get to wholeness. This is a path of salvation in our church, being a part of the world and connecting and taking our love and putting it into action. That's how we get to know our connectedness. It's not just a believie we get to have. Like, it turns into something real that we sense in our beings when we act on it. Henry Nelson Wyman calls this creative interchange. We talk about that a lot in this church. Martin Buber says that all real living is meeting. These are great theologians of our time. And it resonates with me. It's one of the greatest gifts of service. Because when I engage, I feel alive and a part of. I know that I'm useful, and I remember I am connected. What are the gifts of service for you? It's part of why I wanted to have this service not just be me telling you why we do Faith in Action Day, but why I wanted to hear from different people in our church. What does it mean? Where are we going to go from here? What does it look like to be a church who values what we value, who understands our connectedness in the way that we do? What does that call us to do and be together as a people to really enact our faith? Let's not be just Louis C.K. fans and have believies. Let's find ways into service. Let's find ways into acting and being role models and shining lights together. So I invite you to join me in a time of centering. Because I want you to think for yourself about why you serve, what gifts you've found. Maybe you haven't done much service in your life. Maybe this is a new invitation for you. But I invite you to share in the centering that we offered for all of the groups last week, which is to feel your feet on the earth, on this beautiful planet, to look at the people around you, just see who's here. These are your companions on this journey. You are not alone. And to breathe in the breath that connects us all. And from this place of mindfulness, I invite you to remember where you were. If you were with us last week for our Faith in Action Day, I invite you to think about where you were and who you were with. And if you weren't, think about the last time you turned a believie into an action. Who was with you? What motivated you to be in that place? What happened when you were there? What did you do? Did anything surprise you? Anything have particular meaning for you? What unexpected gifts did you discover in serving needs greater than your own?